have been even possible.
Makes sense.
So it really wouldn't. I mean, it was getting to the point where I was, every time I was having research, I was having a major find after a major find. You know, again, we went from a list of 12 known incidents to 150.
You know, it's
So,
amazing. When you think about it, because I know there's some projects that I worked on years ago when I was in Green Bay. This is like in the late 90s. And, you know, I thought the research was pretty good. But now when I go back and view some material that I had done projects on, exhibits on, you know, you just go over it now. It's incredible what you can find now.
Okay, we're set with the live stream, so you can go ahead and do your thing, John.
Okay, however you want to do this. Brianna, what, you give them a high sign and just go?
Do your introduction and then welcome Brian.
I can introduce myself.
Go.
Hi, I'm supposed to be on vacation today, but like everything, I usually take over. So sorry, John. My name is Rena Sisson, Executive Director of the Berrien County School Association. Thank you for those who are joining us online, as well as those who are here in person. Just a few things. It's going to annoy me. I'm going to turn the sound off on the YouTube video. Just a few notes of some upcoming events and programs. We have 2 more sessions of our. John, can you go turn the sound off on the YouTube video, please? For our interviews. We have 2 more sessions. Two more sessions of our Ghost Stories with Tennessee players inside Murdoch Log Cabin, the 16th and the 30th. We start at 7:30. It's completely free, but donations are accepted, and we're pretty excited about this partnership during the show on the 2nd. So we have about 12 or 13 people, which is about a good size for the Murdoch Cabin. It's a little too warm for the fire, but we're power to it. We will be doing trick-or-treating on the grounds here on October 31st. We are promoting it 5 to 7, but the village has announced that ours are 6 to 7:30, so we'll be alternate from 5:30 to 7:30. So those who want to do some pre-trick-or-treating can come and visit all the buildings and do their thing. It'll be free. We are looking for volunteers. If anyone wants to come and pass out candy, please let us know. We'd be happy to have you. Costumes are village, but if you don't want to dress up, that's fine, because I didn't do it last year. I don't know if I'll do it this year. Our next TNC talk next month is about fishing lures, more specifically fishing lure companies here in Berrien County and in Michiana. That's September, or excuse me, I'm going to go back in time. That's November 11th, 6:30 here. We will have nothing in December because of Familiar Christmas Spirits the same day. We currently have open Chalk Fest, which is next door. It's our School Life in Berrien County exhibit. Feel free to check out the really awesome article in the Palladium with some wonderful pictures by Don Campbell per usual. But we're all about Halloween here this month, and we decided to bring a different talk that's not quite Berrien County related, but very passionate by many people, especially among the Twilight set. Yes, about vampire in America. So I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Berrien Carroll with the House of David, who's talking about a very decidedly non-House of David topic tonight. So Brian, it's all for you.
Well, thanks for coming. I appreciate it. Yeah, I've been working on this project off and on since about 7 years now, and so it's a project that took me in directions and did things that I haven't really, I'm really surprised by it. And I've done presentations actually all over the country on this talk. So I've done in Ohio and California, Boston, and San Francisco. So I've actually done a few presentations around the place. And I used to live in Seattle, so I did a number in the Seattle area as well. So anyway, done a lot of presentations on this. I had one ready and I reread it about a week ago, and I felt it was too dry and scholarly and boring. And I was like, wow, I really read this in front of people. This is terrible. So I decided to make it a little more off the cuff, but I still do need to stick to my notes, because if I don't stick to my notes, I'll get way off topic and I'll talk for 4 hours. So I'm going to try as best as I can to stick to my notes, and I will be a little more organic and breezy than what I hoped. So before Dracula, history of vampire belief in America. So 2 things jump out when you see that title, or should jump out. Vampire belief in America, vampire belief is associated with Europe. And most people don't realize that people actually did believe in vampires, not just wrote books and fiction and so forth about them, but actually believed vampires were real in early modern Germany and Poland and places like that. And they also did in the United States in the 1700s and 1800s. That's not a very well-known phenomenon. So before Dracula, Dracula was written in 1897, and almost everything I talk about happens before 1897. Matter of fact, the last incidence of vampire belief in the United States was reported in 1899, so just 2 years after Bram Stoker's book comes out. So when Bram Stoker's book comes out and it becomes the template for all later literature, movies, theater, film, everything about vampires, is really all just rehashed versions of what's in Bram Stoker's Dracula. But this is all happening, this is everything that's going on before. So what is that? In the United States. And Bram Stoker traveled extensively in the United States and wrote big sections of Dracula in the United States and had access to newspaper reports talking about some of the things that happened. So that particularly struck me to find that in the notes. So all right. So here's our usual, this is our starting points. What everyone knows, Dracula, vampires, the fangs, bloods, capes, all that kind of stuff. The standard stuff. So, but I thought to myself, okay, we're going back before Dracula was written, and when you want to study anything, what do? You ask those same basic questions: who, what, when, where, how, why. So we're going to look at American vampire belief from that perspective: who, what, when, where, how, why. Okay. So, yeah, so that's where we're at. So, what do you want to talk about? When anyone want to learn anything, what do you want to ask? Who was involved? What happened? When did it happen? Where did it happen? How did it happen? And why? So this is the organized principle of this talk. I'll go who, what, when, where, how. The why I could go on forever, and that's at the end. So that's good because then you can just cut me off whenever the talk's supposed to be over. Otherwise, I just go on and on. So why did this happen? So what to ask about American vampire? Who did it involve? What exactly happened? Like what did people do with this belief? Were we surprised? And what were people's reactions to it? When did it happen? What were the sort of key phases in the development of this belief? The one thing is, it wasn't here at the beginning. It didn't come in the 1600s with the earliest settlers. It was introduced later. So key phases in the development, and also how it changed over time. It sticks around for about 125 years, this belief. And it's different at different times. At the beginning, in the middle, and the end, it's quite different. Where did it happen? So and on top of where was it going on in the United States, where did the belief actually come from? This is one of my favorite parts of the project, to learn this aspect of how it got to the United States and was introduced. Last part, how did it happen? How did this phenomenon, how did it go down? What exactly happened? But mixed into that is, how do we know what happened? What are the sources? Where did I find all the information on this? Second part, how popular and widespread was this? Was this like random stuff, or was this like pretty widespread? And how did the people at the time perceive what they were doing? What did they think of what they were doing? What did they think they were doing? We can look back and be like, oh my God, what were they doing? But what did they think they were doing? So that's a favorite question. Why did it happen? And then, of course, why don't we know more about this? Why isn't there more knowledge of this? You'd think this would have been a rich subject for books and movies and whatnot, but in fact, it's not yet. Okay, so important concepts and terms. I'm going to blitz through these, and I'm just looking around the room. I'm going to guess most people are going to know them. Okay, so change over time. That's what historians do. We look at how stuff's introduced, evolves, and then in this case ends. Consumption and consumptive. I figure you probably both everyone knows this. Consumption was the old term for tuberculosis. That's going to be very key. This talk is really all about tuberculosis when you get down to it. Consumptive is someone who had tuberculosis. And tuberculosis was a nasty, brutal lung infection that's still around and still rather a dangerous disease, especially as it's becoming more antibiotic resistant. So tuberculosis can take up to 4 to 7 years to kill you. Back when it was untreated, there was no medicine for it. And so that's a very scary thing. You got weaker and weaker and weaker. It's a horrible, debilitating disease. Without putting too fine a point on it, literally your lungs were rotting in your chest. So horrible, horrible illness. And that's really what this is all about. But with some important distinctions, the difference between an epidemic and an endemic disease. So this is kind of timely. So obviously, an epidemic is a disease that's introduced kind of new into an area and affects a whole bunch of people, then goes away. It might come back periodically, but an epidemic is a periodic thing. It doesn't happen all the time. It's a disease introduced causing a widespread illness. Pandemic, of course, is beyond a region. It's everywhere, and we know what that's like right now. You know, a disease that's everywhere. It's an epidemic that's happening all over the world at the same time. Now, an endemic disease is a disease that's always present. It's all like everyone. There's always people who have it. It's kind of everyone has it, or everyone, every population has a small number of people who have it, and it's kind of like always going kind of at a low level. That's important. That's what tuberculosis really is. Tuberculosis is an endemic disease that's always present, but at certain times, the rate spikes. And I'm going to talk about an incident that it spiked dramatically and actually triggers this whole vampire phenomenon. It's actually tied to a massive tuberculosis outbreak in the United States at a certain point. So a revenant is a kind of catch-all term for any kind of creature that comes back from the dead. And it was used more in Europe. It's based on the French term revenir, to come back. And vampires would technically be a type of revenant, if you want to get technical about it. So a vampire, well, we know what a vampire is, a blood-sucking ghoul comes back from the grave and all that stuff. Now, The Vampire, 1819, was a novel written by a guy named John Polidori. But at the time, everyone thought Lord Byron wrote it. He was this sexy writer, swashbuckling character who fought in revolutions and, you know, was the latest man. You know, men wanted to be him, women wanted him kind of guy. So everyone thought he wrote it. It's really the first modern vampire story. And it gets miscredited to the wrong guy. His BFF, John Polidori, actually wrote it. And anyway, but it's the first modern vampire story. And it's not unlike Dracula, but just a really toned down version of Dracula. Bram Stoker has a lot to answer for, but it was 7 real Dracula. And it was a big smash hit when it was released in 1819, all over the place. Europe, France, England, France, the United States, huge plays, versions of it everywhere, different knockoff novels. There was a vampire mania in the 1820s in the United States. It lasted through the 1840s. There were operas about vampires and all that kind of stuff. So The Vampire by Polidori kicks off a wave of vampire mania in the US. Yeah.
Where was it? Is it American?
Oh, no, he wrote it in England, actually wrote it in Switzerland, Mary Shelley, it has to do with Mary Shelley, Frankenstein. It's a long story, but it's all tied into that, so, yeah. Mary Shelley, they're sitting around one night at a castle, Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, Polidori, Mary Wollstonecraft, and they're like, hey, let's write some ghost stories. And she comes back with Frankenstein, with a rough draft of Frankenstein, and Polidori comes back with the rough draft of The Vampire. So these two stories go on to become smash hits around the English-speaking world anyway. They were a dare on the same night, on a rainy night in a castle in Switzerland, a bunch of British people on vacation. So anyway, so that's Polidori's contribution to American literature. So, but he didn't get any credit for it, but he did get the money for it. All right, Dracula by Bram Stoker, written in 1897. This next group of terms, Yankee. Most people know the generic term of what a Yankee is, which is just a person from the north. But you can actually get more specific than that. And I know this because I'm from New England. I'm a Boston. A Yankee is someone who is from New England, is an Anglo-American, Protestant, usually an old line Protestant denomination, not a new one. No Baptists or Methodists or anything like that, like Congregationalists primarily. So old, and your family had to be in New England for a long time, like 200, 300 years to be considered a Yankee. So a Yankee in New England is a very specific designation of an old school New Englander. That's actually important because that's the people that start this belief. But those people move, or at least their kids and their grandkids move. And guess where they move to? The upper Midwest. So over time, they start moving westward, and then a lot of them wind up here. And that's why there's actually some incidents here in Michigan. There's actually 3 incidents in Chicago of this. Moving on from that. So sympathetic magic. The best description of sympathetic magic is the classic voodoo doll. You take a doll, stab a pin in it, somebody in the other room goes, ah! That's sympathetic magic. The idea that you can do something at a distance to something else, and can trigger something else. Okay, this is the vampire belief was a version of sympathetic. Okay, scientific revolution, enlightenment, and industrial revolution. This is the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s. It's a period when there's all these advances in science and understanding of the universe and Newton's laws of gravity and all that kind of stuff. And the idea is that the world, at least the European world, was becoming more and more rational, scientific, superstition and all that stuff was, getting pushed out of the way from modern, scientific, rational, logical worldview. Vampire fiction's that all the hell. But anyway, the vampire belief is going on at exactly the same time, and things are supposedly getting more scientific. Autopsy and dissection, well, we'll get to those, but those are key. And professionalize and professionalization. Professionalization comes in at the very end. It's the cover up at the end. So, all right. Okay, so what to call it? People used to call this, or this starting in the 90s, they started calling this New England vampire belief. The only problem is I've since discovered that it's spilled outside of New England and took place in the upper Midwest and other areas of the United States. So New England doesn't fit anymore because there's plenty of cases that took place outside of New England, although most of them are in New England. And so I've started calling it, and also they didn't use the word vampire to describe it. So that's anachronistic. So my description of it is American medical revenant belief. So I'll explain where that comes from. If you really want to get technical, it's American not there belief. If you really want to get back to the origins of it. All right, so who did this involve? Who are the key players here in this saga of American vampire belief? I jokingly put them into two categories. The exhumers or the diggers, the people who did the digging up of the bodies that they thought were vampires or thought were revenants. And the people who were assumed to be revenants, the dead bodies that they were in fact digging. So who were they? Well, they were New England Yankees. It was thought at one point that they were just all simple country bumpkins, but I found a lot of instances occurred in cities, including Boston, Providence, Rhode Island, other major even industrial cities where it took place. They were white Anglo-Saxon settlers, white Anglo-Americans from New England, Yankees. They were all Protestants, period, end of sentence. And they were all different denominations, sort of old school denominations like Congregationalist, Anglicans, and Presbyterian, but also newer ones, Baptists, Methodists, more radical ones, Unitarian, Universalists, etc., all the way on down the line. So I was really surprised to find there was no particular denomination that was connected to this belief at all. I expected that. I expected there would be certain denominations connected to this. Everybody was doing it. Well, not everyone, but everyone who did it they're all different religions. There are also people doing it were the descendants of Yankees who migrated westward. So they had heard stories or there was folklore in their family about what to do in certain situations when they thought someone was a vampire. And so when they they moved west and built a cabin in Ohio or Michigan or Illinois, which then was the howling frontier from their perspective. There's plenty of people already living there. But there was, they moved to these areas, and when there was a problem, and you needed to take care of that thing in the grave that just won't go away, they fell back on the stories and folklore of their parents and grandparents and dug up the bodies just like their ancestors did. So, and I'll tell you what they did in a minute. But there were some free African Americans in the Northeast that practiced this belief as well, but one can press a couple of references to black families doing this. There is reference to indigenous, specifically Algonquin people of the Northeast practicing this, but they seem to have got it from Europeans. There's only a few incidents of Native Americans doing this, and it was well after the introduction of the belief, so they seem to have picked it up from the local whites. One of the key elements of all this are the German soldier immigrants, what are known in American history as Hessians. I'm going to explain why that's not a great term for them, but that's historically the term people have used for the German mercenaries who came with the British to fight the Revolutionary War. 31,000. They're actually pretty key. Also, doctors of various kinds. The story is very much about medicine and doctors, and who gets to be a doctor. So that's the diggers. Those are the people digging up bodies in the United States from 1782 to 1899. The people who are getting dug up are deceased consumptives, people who have died of tuberculosis and who have family members who are currently alive but sick from tuberculosis. they're mostly young women. That has to do with how TB kills people. It's a disease of young people, or at least it was then. It killed off very young. The average age of death from consumption in the early United States was 26. So there's a lot of teenagers and people in their young 20s dying of tuberculosis. About 2/3 of the people who were dug up were young women who died of tuberculosis, and about 1/3 were young men. There were some older folks, but generally this was a phenomenon of digging up young people who died recently. All right, so what happened in general? Okay. Families with multiple members suffering and dying from tuberculosis exhumed or dug up the corpses of their recently deceased relatives. This is where it gets pretty garish. They thought the corpses were still alive and sucking the soul or life out of the family members, usually their siblings, from a distance. Like they never came out of the grave. It was like some kind of magical, what would I call it, transference, the dog thing. Sympathetic magic, right there. From a distance, they're actually sucking the life out of their relatives. They would thought that's what was making them sick, not tuberculosis, and therefore they had to do something about it. They had to destroy or kill the thing in the grave. Yes, they're definitely dead. Sometimes they've been in the grave for 2, 3, 4, sometimes 7 years. Yeah. So often it's just months, but it's usually at least a few months, if not a few years. So they thought these corpses were still alive, and they thought the corpses were making them sick and would eventually kill the people who were then still sick with tuberculosis. So they would dig these bodies out, cut out the heart, sometimes other organs, the lungs and the liver, and burn them, or sometimes burn the entire corpse, and occasionally decapitate the body. The decapitation probably happened in about 20% of the cases, but I would say a good 75, 80% that cut open the chest, pull the heart out, and burn the heart. They would burn the heart down to ashes, and then take the ashes, usually put it in a liquid, water or wine, and the person who was sick with consumption, they'd give it to them, and they drank it. So, have you ever heard the phrase, like cures like? This is that taken all the way. So this is what the American vampire belief was like from 1782 to 1899. This is what's going on. So that's the basic outline of the phenomenon. There's a lot of variation, like in individual cases. Like sometimes, rather than drink the liquid, when they were actually burning the heart, the sick person who's often on the deathbed was like kind of hauled out, and they stood over the fire and inhaled the fumes. Maybe that happened in 15%, 10% of the cases. So they felt that this was a direct way to inoculate themselves against tuberculosis, which there was absolutely no effective treatments for at the time. There's no antibiotics, they didn't understand that. They didn't even know what bacteria were, they didn't know what viruses were, they didn't know what germs were, they didn't know how the human body worked in any way that we would understand. So there was absolutely no treatment. So what did they call it at the time? What did they call this belief? They didn't call it vampire belief. They had no name for it at all. They just referred to it as that body that was still alive in the grave. It was your sister. We think she's coming back from the dead and sucking the life out of all of us. We better dig her up and burn her. It's your uncle, Steve, who died 3 years ago. We think he's the one. And this one, this is how they would tell. They would dig up the suspected bodies, they would check them out. And anyone that was not decomposed enough, they're like, this person's been dead for 3 years, they should be gone. And they look like they were buried yesterday. I'm suspicious, it's them. And they would cut them open and they would look for liquid blood inside the heart. Because they were like, the blood should have coagulated. If it's liquid, what the hell's keeping this thing alive?
Now, was cremation?
Cremation was not widespread until after the Civil War. So embalming was not practiced until after the Civil War either. So there's no embalming and there's no cremation. Bodies just go in the ground quickly, very quickly. So so that's how they would tell who was the vampire. So you dig 3 people up, your sister-in-law looks like she was buried yesterday, but she's been buried for 4 years. Her brother has only been dead for 2 years. Looks like there's nothing left of him. You're like, why is she still rosy and bright? And, you know, it's her. And, you know, rip the chest open and go to town. So, so that's how they determine it. Now, I'm making fun of this in some ways. I'm making light of it, but I actually shouldn't. All right, so the vampire, they started to use the term vampire at the very end of the belief, maybe in the last 20 years, so about 125 years, and only in the last 20 years did they begin to actually call it vampire. We're going to dig that vampire. So the name vampire gets stuck on it right at the end.
What's the derivation of the word?
Vampire? Get to that in a little bit. Good question. Hang on, we're going to get there. So, okay. So this is the Sabbath. Okay, so what did the people involved think about it at the time? Well, the people involved thought that the soul or part of the soul lingered in the body after death for up to 7 years, and that's an old medieval European belief. That goes way back. The fact that people still believe that in the 1880s, 1890s, it's kind of astonishing, but it's true, and people still believed it. So you could be somewhat alive in the grave. A little bit of your soul, your essence could still be in the body. So that's what they thought. So medical vampire exhumation was a drastic procedure only tried as a last resort. It was something you tried only when you were desperate. You've exhausted every other medical treatment available. This is like the person who has cancer and they've tried everything, and at the end they get into some wacky cures because they've already tried everything else. This is kind of the place that served for tuberculosis. The absolute end of the line. So, and also it was only done by the worst affected families who had multiple members die, often in very quick succession. Like say you had 6 kids, 4 or 5 of them died in 3 years from tuberculosis. People, the neighbors and the family members would take a step back and be like, whoa, this disease is not supposed to kill people this quickly. Something strange is going on. Something supernatural is going on in this family that makes this an aberration. This is different. So not every person who had tuberculosis, they would resort to this. It's only these families that have a bunch of people die in a row quickly. Then they're like, there's something going on in that family. So that's why there aren't thousands of incidences. There's only hundreds of incidences of this. They were desperate. They were trying to save their sick family members, often their adult children. So typically, you know, we're talking about kids who are like 17, 18, 19, 22, 25, 27, and they're going down one after another from tuberculosis. They don't know it. At the time, they thought tuberculosis was hereditary because it seemed to run in certain families. But in fact, it's contagious. So the reason it ran in families was because people lived in the same house, and they all would be breathing the same air and coughing, and it's a respiratory ailment you get by just like you get a cough. It's hard to get TB though. Like you have to be around someone a long period of time to get TB. Usually a chance encounter won't give you TB. You have to live with someone to catch TB from it. So that's why it ran in families. But they thought it was hereditary. So they didn't quarantine anyone who was sick. Because they thought, well, it's your family. You're predisposed to that. You have a consumptive disposition. So they didn't isolate you. And your other family members were living with you, breathing the same air, etc. Wintertime in New England, and in the house. So anyway, these people are desperate, and people are dying. The accounts are painful to read. The utter emotional desperation of the families. Again, people have 6 children, 5 of them have died. They're trying to save the one remaining one by doing this. They're at their wits' end. They're absolutely desperate. And I always say to myself, what would I do in the same situation? What wouldn't you do to save your family, really? You know, I actually have a lot of sympathy for the people. I feel like we shouldn't kind of say, oh, they're ignorant, superstitious. It was, you know, before modern times and all that. I actually pity them, and I think the stories are terribly heartrending. The decision to do this was monumentally devastating on people. There's descriptions of people breaking down, crying while doing it, you know, uncontrollable sobbing, and you know, it's really was born out of a deep sorrow and painful place in these people's lives. They were helpless, and they were trying to feel like they could do something, get some control over the situation. And again, I pity them. So what did people think about it? Most people's reaction. At first, when people started doing this, The early reports are kind of like, well, let's hear how this works. They were cautious, they were curious, and they were sympathetic to the people who were sick. They weren't very judgy in the early accounts in the 1780s and 1790s. They were like, oh, that poor family, this seems kind of drastic, but oh, what else were they going to do? So the accounts are very, and then they all like, well, I wonder if it works. Because everyone else is dying, you know, tuberculosis is a massive killer of that era, so they're all curious whether it works. So the early accounts are cautious, curious, and sympathetic. And then there begins to be a debate, and the debate takes place in medical literature, medical journals, and letters between doctors. And they're basically like, I tried it out on somebody, and I don't think it worked. And another person would write back, I did try it, and I think it did work. The guy got better. And then one guy, my favorite guy, was he polled 7 other local doctors. And he's like, well, 3 said it worked, 3 said it didn't, and the other guy isn't sure. So the debate, oddly enough, is not in the newspapers, it's not in the pulpit, it's not people like being morally outraged about it. The debate is going on between doctors. I was stunned by it. I was like, wow, I was waiting for the angry minister. Where's the angry minister being like, this is sacrilegious? Nothing. For the first 40-something years, no ministers come out against this practice. In the 1820s and 30s, boy, they come out against it big time, but not until then, and that's 40-something years after the belief is introduced. So for the first 40 years, there's no religious condemnation of it. Matter of fact, there's no religious connotation to it. Ministers and clergy are present at the exhumations. They approve of them. They sign off of them in some cases. Sometimes they participate, and I mean actively, like in the grave with the shovel, tearing the boards off the top of the coffin, kind of participating. As a matter of fact, the most detailed descriptions we have are of a minister doing 3 of these over the course of 1787 and 88. He digs up 3 different people and takes copious notes on it, and they read like an autopsy. They're like detailed medical notes. And he's a minister. He's the town minister of Belchertown, Massachusetts. His name was Justice Forward. And 9 of his 11 children died of consumption. He was absolutely desperate. 9 of his 11 children. I just think about that and I'm like, of course he was down in the grave with a shovel. What else did he have left at that point? He's like, I'll try anything. Great name though, Justice Forward. He should have been a judge, really, but like a great name for a minister. So. Now, by the 1870s, though, the tail end of it, it was seen as backwards, superstitious, and it was an embarrassing thing that you didn't talk about. So early on, it was like, hey, does it work? This is maybe a viable medical thing, maybe not. Then there's a big debate in the middle period where those people support it and a bunch of people against it. Some people claim to have science saying it works. Some people say they have science it doesn't work. And at the end, everyone's like, well, that's something the Hicks do in the backwoods, and civilized people don't do that. In New England, the term for that is, we don't use hick and redneck in New England, they're swamp Yankees. That's what swamp Yankees do, this weird stuff. So,
Question.
Yep.
Is the whole I mean, obviously the swamp Yankee thing, but by the 1870s, it sounds like most of those who were practicing it had moved westward into the frontier.
The epicenter of the belief starts in New England, then it moves to upstate New York, where most of the cases are actually going on in upstate New York.
Right.
It never quite gets beyond maybe Western New York, even though it's happening in other places.
But it's happening more on the frontier than it is in the cities as it had been, right?
It still happens in New England, but increasingly it happens in rural areas.
Not to say rural versus urban, where it was common in the urban areas in the early years, it became more of a rural phenomenon by the end.
Yes,
right?
by the end, it's definitely more of a rural phenomenon.
So the backward could be tied to the fact that rural people,
yes,
educated.
that's very much, when you read the newspaper accounts, the late newspaper accounts, that's what they sound like. Oh, those people, those Hicks out in the woods. Of course they're doing that. Like, what else would they do? So that's the reaction. It's a little bit different at different times. This is supposed to be the era of the Enlightenment, when people are doing science and experimentations and society is moving forward, and yet you have this practice that to us would seem horribly barbaric and garish. But to them, it was science. This was science to Americans. Okay, so when did this happen? First documented exhumation is in Wilmington, Connecticut, which is absolutely a forgettable little postage stamp of a town. It only had one significant thing in terms of why it happened here, which I'll get into in just a second. And the last documented case is Pittsfield, Massachusetts in 1899. So there are roughly, stats, I don't want to get to how many cases there are, or known cases. Okay, so a little geography, here's New England. That's the area the belief starts in. Wilmington's right there in the middle. I went to the University of Connecticut, which is 2 towns over from Wilmington, and so I know exactly where Wilmington is. I know exactly where this happened. I've been to the cemetery several times, but had no luck finding the Johnson family graves that were mentioned. Stones are probably long since not built. The last case was there, but you guys remember the belief spread pretty far west. So the first and last cases are here, but there were a lot more cases than us. There's supposedly a case that happened in Cincinnati in 1922, but I've never been able to confirm it, like nail down any kind of description and source of it. So I don't know if that one's accurate. I've left it out of my study because I've never been able to corroborate it that it happened in 1920, 1922. Yeah.
Are they at this time calling it vampires?
Not in the 1780s, but by the 1870s, yeah. So, okay, so here's little Willington. Now, the only thing significant about Willington, which I will tell you now, is the town next to it is Tolland, another bigger but still small little farming town. And then East Windsor, it's now a big city, but back then was a little farming town. What's significant is there were 2 very large prisoner of war camps here during the American Revolution. There was one in Tolland for officers, or German officers, captured at the Battle of Saratoga at Bennington in 1777. And this was for the camp for the enlisted men captured at, well, there was actually other camps in other parts, but there were hundreds of POWs, German POWs, Tolland, East Windsor, and Tolland Green is 2 miles from the Wilmington Cemetery. So that's actually important. Tolland Green was where they actually had an encampment with the prisoners, like in tents on Tolland Green. So this is actually the newspaper article describing the first known case, or the first case that they described in 1784, where members of the Johnson family were exhumed and their bodies were burned. This one, Moses Holmes is the guy writing the piece. He was a selectman, and he was present and took part in the exhumation. He mentions a quack foreign doctor who taught everyone how to do this, and that they've been doing them for a couple of years in the area. So it's a prisoner of war camp holding Germans right next door, 2 miles down the road. So, all right. So phases. 1782 to 92 is the introduction of the belief, kind of how it's initially spread. It takes about 10 years to kind of spread. Second phase, 1790, about to 1820, when it's accepted as a mainstream medical belief. It's discussed in medical journals. And the doctors are doing it around shady. The guy who does the one in 1784, Dr. Jeremiah West, he later becomes the president of the Connecticut Medical Association. So we're talking doctors with credentials. So this is when it's accepted and actually not questioned that often. That is what I call a schizophrenic period between 1820 and 1870, when you find a ton of people against the belief, but a ton of people still cling to the belief, thinking it works. And depends on the doctor, the family, the people. Just as many say people will fight for it and say it works, and just as many people say that's ridiculous. And then there's that last period of decline when it kind of turns into folklore, even though it had been established medical belief, introduced from the top down by doctors. It kind of goes back to being kind of a thing of the people and about superstition and spirituality. The process is called demedicalization. All right, so where did this happen? New England's the epicenter of it. In particular, the Connecticut River Valley. So the towns going from here up through here are the first towns that occurs in. And there was a lot of roads and travel, and people were related in these areas, like the people from this town, like this town, and like this town. So the grandparents lived here, the kids lived here, and the grandkids lived there. So there's a lot of movement between these areas, a lot of contact between these towns. People didn't come this way in New England, this way. And then it spills into Vermont very early as well. And so, and then it spreads out from there. So the first 10 years, it's limited to that strip, pretty much. Connecticut River Valley spread to the rest of the region by 1800. By the 1790s, it appears in upstate New York, but again, it's almost always a New England family who has moved westward. The cases in the 1790s are two Connecticut families who moved from Stonington, Connecticut to Ballstown, New York, and conduct from there. The practice spreads to the Midwest in the 1810s and about the 1860s, brought by westward migrating Yankees and their descendants. There's incidents in Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, and Wisconsin. Not a ton, but a fair number of incidents. Again, that we know of. I think many of these happened without anyone ever reporting. So, all right, so basically you've got your initial area, and then as the people migrate, the belief comes with them. It never got very far south. It got into a few communities in Pennsylvania, and a few communities, and one community in Kentucky. And Chicago, and then there was a town up here, Berrien, Wisconsin. I don't know exactly where it is, but here. Was as far west as I can find it. I can't find it any further west. Well, there's one incident during the gold rush in California that may be it's hard to tell whether it was exactly one. So where does it come from before that? Well, it obviously comes from Europe. It comes from the medieval period. So this is the period that this is the part I got really kind of sucked into as I did it. So, so the one thing that I learned very quickly in this project was, okay, so it starts in New England. New Englanders are Anglo-Americans, or it's the name New England, they're all from Britain, where their ancestors were. So it was, to my surprise, that the vampire belief did not exist in the English-speaking world in the 1600s and 1700s. There was no vampire. British people, American colonists, never heard of a vampire. They had plenty of ghosts and goblins and ghouls and stories that they told, but they did not have the vampire. That did not exist in the English-speaking world. So where did they get the idea? They get the idea from the medieval revenant tradition. So the earliest vampire-like creatures, and here we get to the etymology or the evolution, the earliest vampire-like creatures come from Icelandic Scandinavian lore called Draugr. They're very similar to vampires. And the belief spreads from Iceland back to the mother countries in Scandinavia, then to England. This is around the year 1000. Then the belief spreads down into Europe, Central Europe, across into Eastern Europe, down into Southern Europe, and by the 1400s or 1500s, it's in the Middle East. So there's always this assumption that the belief actually goes this way, that it starts in Eastern Europe and spreads out. No, that's actually newer in Eastern Europe than it was everywhere else. The only problem is the belief dies out in most of Europe by 1400, but stays present in this area. So British people, like back in the 1200s, were exhuming bodies they thought were revenants, burning them, chopping them up, staking them, whatever. But 400 years later, their ancestors had never heard of such a thing. It ceased to exist as a practice. So the belief was particularly common in, what we say, northeastern Germany and the Czech Republic and Poland. So there's a very robust belief in revenants there. And there were different types of revenants. Again, vampire was one type, but there were many different types. There was Draugr, there was just a standard revenant, which is kind of more like a zombie. There's a Jangr, there's all different translations that turn out to be the walking, wandering, the restless dead, the returning dead, the chewing dead, the masticating dead. There was a belief that a lot of vampires would chew on the winding sheets that they were wrapped in, so that's where the chewing thing comes from. So there's all these different variations of walking, wandering, restless, returning, chewing, chomping, eating, dead, etc. Then in Germany, they kind of created an umbrella term they called Wiedergaben, which means undead, those who come back. And they come up with a particular version in northeastern Germany called the Naxe, which is also known as the chewing, masticating, or smacking the dead. So, and schmatzen, and then the Neuntoter, which is like another version of the Naxe. The Naxer is important because it sucks soul, and it's a body that stays alive in the grave but never physically gets out of the grave. It just magically sucks your soul from a distance. And you destroy it by digging it up, cutting open the heart, cutting it open, take the heart out, burning the heart, taking the ashes, putting them in liquid, and giving them to people who are sick. Sound familiar? It's New England version. And they generally had no name for it. In Knox-Ayer term, they don't come up with the terms until about 1800. And so they, before that, everyone's just like the corpse that isn't dead, that is preying on your uncle or us. And it's spread in families the same way. It's virtually identical. The Knox-Ayer belief is identical to the New England, later New England. Down to the fact that they had no name for it. Like they had the belief but no term for it. Vampire, Upi or Virkolakis in Greek and all the other different myriad, Strigoi, which is Russian, I think, all these different versions of it. The vampire is different. And the people in Germany were like, what? Vampires aren't real, that's crazy. That's like bizarre. They thought Knox-Ayer were real, vampires were crazy, loony, out of like, how could they believe that? And vampires were basically exactly like Knox-Ayer, except they didn't suck the soul out of you from afar. They actually physically got up out of the grave and walked over to you and bit you and sucked the blood directly out of your body. When people from Germany heard about this crazy belief that the Slavic people had, they were like, they are nuts. Everyone knows Knox-Ayer are real and vampires are fake. There was a big debate about it in the 1720s and 30s. All kinds of theologians and philosophers weighed on. Even Voltaire jumped into it from France. And he's like, let me tell you what's going on. But basically the debate boiled down to Germans were like, the Knox-Ayer is real because it's German and we know it and it's real and we can prove it. The vampire is crazy, loony, Slavic belief, and you know, they're very racist stuff, very discriminatory and bigotry towards Slavs. So the whole debate about the existence of vampires in Europe was an opportunity to slam Slavic people, throw them under the bus, make fun of them for being rubes or whatever. But then the Germans would be like, yeah, Knox-Ayer were real. My uncle saw one, and my grandfather said he saw one, and so this is. Think of the vampire as one of many competing different versions of these revenants, and it's the least popular one. But obviously we know that thanks to Polidori and definitely thanks to Bram Stoker, it becomes the big one that everyone knows. The version, which is one of many, becomes the dominant version. And everyone forgets about all these. It's just all about that. So the Dracula effect I have is like, it's like a bulldozer. It just destroys all of these earlier beliefs and they all get absorbed. Within like one lifetime, everyone's like, I've never heard of the Knox-Ayer, even though it's the dominant belief in Germany. People are like, I've never heard of it. Because this book came out, which was actually in English. Yeah, better marketing. The vampire had better PR. So the Knox-Ayer, Knock meaning after, Zaire to live off of. Doesn't translate cleanly into English. It's like one who lives off you after he dies. Doesn't work out to be a smooth translation. After either, I don't know what I would call it. Variant version of the vampire, common in 18th century northern Germany. When disease would kill multiple members of the same family in quick succession, they would say, it's a Knox-Ayer. Killed by burning the heart and give the ashes. So it's virtually a carbon copy of the American, or the American version is a carbon copy of the Knox-Ayer. Okay, so just to compare the difference between the modern Dracula vampire and the Knox-Ayer. Knox-Ayer, no fangs. Vampire fangs. Knox-Ayer was always like a regular peasant country folk. It wasn't this is always some elite aristocrat, like a count or a duke or something like that, little asses and cape thing. So the Knox-Ayer was just regular, like farmer or a farmer's daughter usually is the Knox-Ayer. Typically a young female, whereas the popular vampire, thanks to Bram Stoker, becomes a mature middle-aged man. The Knox-Ayer was associated with disease, specifically bubonic plague. Whereas popular vampire is associated with sex. Usually the Knox-Ayer was a family member, somebody who knew. And the popular vampire from Bram Stoker is a stranger from a foreign location you don't know. There's absolutely no connection to bats or flying in the Knox area. So it's just how much the belief changed in the novels, the novels. Turns into bat flies. Never described as vampire, called vampire. The Knox area is a gaunt, semi-rotten corpse that just lays there in the grave. And of course, the vampire is well dressed and dapper. And, this one sucks the life force of soul. This one sucks blood. The Knox area never leaves the grave. It just lays there and sucks the life out of it from the distance. Whereas the vampire gets up, visibly walks around, talks to you, interacts with people, goes back to the grave afterwards, comes back out again later. So it's ambulatory. It's up and it's moving around and it's conscious. The Knox area is often described like an unconscious body. It's just still not done. And it's like almost like a battery that needs energy and it's siphoning it off the people it was closest to in life, its relatives. So it's almost like they see it as on a body that won't die that's on autopilot. That's my best description of the Knox area. It's a body that won't die and it's just on autopilot. So no religious overtones to the Knox area. No crucifixes, holy water, or any of that stuff. Of course, here you get crucifixes, garlic, holy water, all that stuff. Usually you kill this one by burning its heart or cutting its head off. As we know, the famous one, the Slavic one, you just kill it with a stick. I haven't come across a single incident in the United States where someone killed an American vampire with a stick. Burning the heart was like 100% of the cases, or the whole body. So fire was the one time in Vermont, in Bennington, Vermont, they actually cut the person open, took the heart out, put it on the blacksmith's forge right in the center of town. It was like pumping the bellows, and that's how they destroyed it. So that was quite an interesting description. The town butcher cut it out, gave it to the blacksmith who burned it on the forge. All right, so this sort of thing. Okay, how does the belief get here? Well, this is where we get back to our German soldiers in the American Revolution. Hessians. Woo, there they are. All right, so Hessians is not a good name to describe all of these Germans who came to fight the American Revolution. There's almost 30,000 of them. A little more than half are actually from Hesse. So the term gets applied to everybody, even though these people were not necessarily from Hesse. And even the Hessians recruited all over Germany. So just because you were in the Hessian army, you might have been from Prussia or somewhere else. You just signed up for their military. But anyway, they all get called Hessians in general, so I'll use that, even though people who are specialists in German history will be like, no. But anyway, these guys, 30,000 of them come over to fight the American Revolution. 6,000 stay in the United States. So what's that, a quarter? 1/5. So 1 in 5 stays, does not return to Europe. Germany is a cultural designation at this time. There was no unified country that is Germany. There was 315 separate German states. This is a political map of Germany at the time, or around the time of the American Revolution. So even to call someone German, it's really an ethnic designation. It's about what language they spoke, not what country they were from. They could be from the Maghreb Moravia, be a German, or be from Tyrol, or be a German. So it's an ethnic or language cultural designation. And this is the area where the Nazi was really prominent. How did these Germans get in? They're the ones that spread the belief. How did they get in? And how did they actually spread it? So, well, Battle of Bennington, August 1777, 400 German troops from the Duchy of Brunswick were captured. And they're brought to Holland, at least Windsor, Connecticut, to be put in a camp there. Battle of Saratoga fought shortly afterwards and captured 2,300 Brunswick, Hessian, and Ansbach, all German troops, who get brought to New England and put in prisoner camps there. It's also the British-occupied Newport, Rhode Island, which is an island, for the entire American Revolution, pretty much. They had a huge garrison, more than 3,000 German troops on the garrison, and 300 to 400 of them just deserted. They just left in the middle of the war. Actually, it was cool. It got really cold in 1778, the winter, the Valley Forge winter, and you could run across to the mainland. And then all kinds of guys were like, the sentries could see them running across. So I always thought that was a neat description. So anyway, so the Hessian desertion rate, so there's more Germans coming in. And there's about, when you boil it down to about 4,500 Germans running around New England at the height of the American Revolution. And this is an area that has no German population normally. Other parts of the United States have tons of Germans. New Jersey, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, especially Pennsylvania, upstate New York, all had large ethnic German populations. 1 in 8 Americans was a German and German speaker at the time of the American Revolution. But New England was like straight British. There was like, there were no German communities in there. So to throw 4,000 or 5,000 Germans into New England at the height of the Revolution, they stood out. There were no other Germans in the area. Okay, so then I started saying to myself, this all seems really random. Let's try plotting all these incidents on a map. So I started plotting them on a map, and I'm like, oh, this seems really random. I don't see any connection between any of these. So I was like, all right, this isn't even all of them. This is kind of like just half of it, really. So, but then I was like, all right, there's got to be a pattern here. So being from the area, I said to myself, well, I should superimpose the road system onto this map. Not the road system now, the road system then. Some of the roads that are here now, right there. So what were the major roads at the time? It's highway, now it's known as Route 1, goes all the way from Canada to Florida to Key West. Then Ten Rod Road, that was mentioned to you earlier, cuts right across an area where there's the largest concentration of vampire incidents occur there. This is Route 2. From Plymouth, Massachusetts, to Albany, New York. This is currently I-91. That's Route 2. That's 2. And then this is, yeah, all right, so these are the roads. And then it's got the third one. So I was like, okay, these incidents actually seem to be connected. It seems they're all on major highways, or the major highways at the time. So then I was like, okay, well, where can I find German doctors like the guy that was described in that one account? So this is a location of all known German doctors that I could find. There were 35 of them. So you start to see what the pattern, they're fairly close to where the vampire incidents occur. Then I was like, all right, now let's superimpose where the prisoner of war camps were. Russians. So these are the garrisons and prisoner of war camps. Then when you superimpose where the German doctors are, it makes a lot of sense. So what happens is, when they put these prisoners there, the American government is broke during the American Revolution. They have very little money to fight the war. They're borrowing money from France. They found it very hard to keep a bunch of prisoners, like 1,000 prisoners or 500 prisoners in the same location, keep them housed, fed, and clothed. So they're like, this is too much. The resources are too much. So what they decided to do is take these guys, and they created a parole system where they sent 1, 2, 3, or 4 different Hessians out to different farmers. They essentially leased them out as farmhands, and they literally spread all across the area surrounding where the camps are. All the different towns have, every farm has 1 or 2 Hessians on it. It's easier to support them. They get a little stipend from the government to pay for the food and whatever. And it's like a cultural immersion program. These German guys get dropped in, they learn the language, the culture, they start like marrying the farmers' daughters, and that's why, honestly, the main reason many of them stay is because they got married. That's got to be the #1 reason. So these Germans started integrating, and in particular, among these 4,500 Germans that are paroled to every single town in New England, pretty much, are about 400 medical personnel, who many of them just become itinerant doctors and begin traveling around the area and selling their services as physicians, as surgeons, as apothecaries, doing medical treatments all around the area. And this is where Wilmington is, 2 camps, a bunch of German doctors. Again, so someone from the Tallinn camp comes teaches Jeremiah West how to do this American, after he done several of them. Jeremiah West starts doing it, and then other doctors start asking Jeremiah West, hey, what did you do? How did you do it? Why did you do it? Jeremiah West's uncle is here. And he's part of a large network of physicians that are based all around the valley. Letters start crisscrossing to one another about the practice, and then it starts to spread from there. So really, it's the town doctor, the American town doctor in Bennington, I can go work. He had to go a little bit in the army. He's the one who is the first American to do it. So it crosses over at that point. So the German doctors are doing it in the area. It could be one German doctor. I haven't nailed down who it was yet because all the references to him, they never say his name. They're like, there's this German, there's this foreigner who told us how to do it. But they never say his name. Could be multiple guys, could be one guy doing this. And they're from the area, I think it's the guys from Brunswick are from the area where there's very active belief in Knoxville.
No documentation.
I have a list of 35 doctors. I don't know which one it is. I have a sort of a hot list of 5 that are my top suspects. Well, anyway. So what's going on at the time of the American Revolution is there's a smallpox epidemic, almost exactly in the years of the American Revolution. It's a pandemic too. This is a smallpox pandemic that goes around the globe twice. Kills enormous numbers of people. Tons of Native Americans on the frontier, but also people in cities, people in Washington's army, the soldiers dropping dead in the fighting. The British are kind of skating by unscathed. You know why? They were all vaccinated. Vaccination or inoculation actually had started in England and become a common thing. It was too controversial in America. They didn't want to vaccinate people for smallpox, so people were dying in droves of smallpox in the United States. Anyway, some things never change. So more things change, more they stay the same. So this was a devastating thing. Also, the war brought famine, dislocation, caused a huge refugee problem. Also, large numbers of troops moving around spread other diseases, typhus, there were massive dysentery outbreaks around the camps, and then people would go back home and spread dysentery in their own towns. So the revolutionary era is there's a lot of sickness. People are dying in large droves. TB was already killing 20% of the population. So everyone in New England, like ranked cause of death, 20% of people were dying from tuberculosis. During the American Revolutionary years, immediately following the smallpox epidemic and following the war, right at the end of the war, the rate shoots up to 45%. So that means that every 100 people dying, at least in the north, in like New England, every 100 people dying, 45 of them were dying from tuberculosis in the years 1782 to 1789. Exactly the point when this is introduced, this belief. In Europe, the vampire belief can be tied to any disease, but typically the bubonic plague. Here in the United States, it's solely linked to tuberculosis because the time it spread was exactly the time of a massive tuberculosis outbreak. Any guesses as to why it follows the heels of the smallpox epidemic? Why does TB shoot up after smallpox has come through? Any guesses? You ever get a TB test? And if it does like a ring or something like that, you think TB? It's because most people who have TB carry it around in latent form, and you have the infection, but it's not active. And most people who have it go their whole life without ever developing an active case and die of something else. But if your immune system gets compromised and you have this passive latent form of TB, then it switches into an active form. It's an endemic disease, it's always there. 45% of the population is dying between 1782 and 1789 of tuberculosis. How many people already had tuberculosis before the war? Almost everyone. So it's hard times that lower the collective immune systems of people, triggering all these passive cases of TB to become active. More people don't have TB during the revolution. More people are dying from TB. And these German doctors are wandering around town after town, seeing families just decimated and devastated by this disease, and they've got nothing to offer them. So they pull out the Noxing and say, dig up your sister-in-law, she's the cause of it. Your brother is a vampire who's killing the rest of the family, it's his fault. They've got nothing else to offer, so they dredge up what they know from the past, from their own home communities, and introduce it to America. American doctors pick up on it, and off they go. It's born in this desperate, rough period right at the end of the American Revolution. So in 1883, of course, they discover that it's actually bacteria, and it's not an undead relative coming back to kill you, and and things improve from there. But oddly enough, the belief doesn't die out right away. They know by 1883 it's a bacteria. The cases go on for another 15 years. So some people just don't want to change. The belief is ingrained in some populations, so on. TB is nasty. I don't want to get into the effects of it, but it causes all kinds of problems. And the reason why they thought this sometimes worked is TB will go into remission on its own periodically, no matter what you do, whether you're getting treatment or not. Like, say, all of us have TB. You and I might die in 2 years, but you two go into remission, and you're like, I'm fine now. And if that happened right after they dug up your nephew and burned his heart, you're like, wow, it worked, I'm fine. And you might stay TB free for another 15 or 30 years, whereas you and I died in 2 or 3 years. It's a funky disease that was unexplainable to the people living through it. They had no idea why it would come and go and affect some people and not others. But the fact that it would go into remission means that just enough people who did this got better because they went into remission, not because drinking the ashes of their deceased brother helped. So again, I can't get back to this image, like, what would you do if a bunch of your kids are dying? I don't know. It seems bizarre, but then again, I think, what would that do to me? I have one kid, I'm losing one child, I'm losing multiple children. So before the American Revolution and afterwards, the rate goes back down. 1 in 4 deaths is attributable to TB. If you take out children, take out everyone under 10. 1 in 3 adults died from TB. It's unbelievable. 1 out of 3 people died from TB. Kills young people. Average age of consumptive at time of death is 26. You get it for 4 to 7 years usually before you die. So that means most people are getting infected in their late teens, early 20s, and dying by their mid 20s. So the obituaries in the paper are heartrending because they're like, our 22-year-old daughter just died. Our 25-year-old son just got married and had a kid and bought a farm. He just died. They're heart-wrenching, the obituaries. Absolutely devastating. And cities and towns were impacted. The death rate was higher in cities than it was in the countryside, but it's still pretty high out in the countryside. The real variable is how many people lived in your house. And in New England, there was city and country, the average was 11 people per dwelling. Now, I've never seen like that kind of house that on the frontier back in the day. They weren't big. Maybe there were 11 people in them. We breathe in that air, TB spreading among the family. Women died at a much greater rate, a ratio of 2 to 1, largely because women worked indoors in more confined spaces, kitchens, doing things like weaving. Also, if someone got sick in the family, who took care of the young women of the family. So the female caregivers are getting sick and dying from tuberculosis as well. Here's the kicker. One thing kills the TB bacillus. Well, now antibiotics do. Sunlight. So who worked outside? The men. Farmers mostly. Now you notice, one thing I noticed was the rate for men goes up as you get into the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. Because men's occupations are changing. They're going into what kind of work? Factories and industry. All of a sudden, the male rate goes back up. Whereas early on, so many men were farmers that far fewer were getting sick and dying. So the death rates from TB, say around 1780, were like female, male. As you get, the females will come down, the males come up and meet them at around the same level. Which I found really interesting. That industrialism caused more men to die. All right, here's my hit list of doctors. This is again, there's 35. These are my rounded up the most logical suspects. The ones in red are the ones I'm not 100% sure, but they're my odds-on favorites. This guy is my #1 favorite, Dr. Johann Peter Sippel. He was one of those, like 2 or 3 of these doctors who were Hessians who were doctors for the German soldiers, deserted during the war, and then joined the Continental Army and became a physician in the Continental Army. So these two both did that. And they're 2 of my leading suspects. But what happened was Sippel became an itinerant. He traveled from town to town to town. And Rotliff settled down in one town, but it was right next to where a lot of things occurred. Whereas Sippel traveled from Vermont to Rhode Island back and forth on a circuit, passing through dozens of towns where vampire exhumations later occurred. So these are my odds-on favorites as being what I call Dr. V, the guy introducing this. So it could be any of it. It could be Julius Vosmus, who has a diary. His diary is fascinating. Although he doesn't describe doing any vampire exhumations, he just goes, I went to town and treated 6 patients. You don't even know what he did. This is from Vosmus's diary, and these are the towns he practiced medicine in. He had 2 offices. He had such a successful practice, he set up 2 offices. And one was in a tavern. He'd go there like 2 days a week and then go back to the other one. Anyway. So these are the towns he practiced medicine in, but he would periodically, in the towns between as he was traveling, stop, offer medical treatments and things like that to people and keep going. So this is one guy, and that's his range of effect. And this is his diary only covers a 4 or 5 year period. And he treated people with all of those towns. So that's one of these doctors. If more than one is doing it, and they're traveling around, that one guy who would start here in Newport, and he would travel all the way up to Albany, and over to Vermont, back down, find more medicines here, go all the way back down to them and back down. That's why I think it's him. He's all over the place. These are the obituaries. They're pretty bad. Mrs. Charity, wife of Ephraim Beaver, age 26, consumption had gradually wasted from her body. The roses had faded from her cheeks. Her form indeed had felt decay, and her spirit seemed to brighten as it took flight. Calmly she looked at the grave and assured her was looking for age 26. Even faced with mortality that young. At Belchertown, this is actually the wife of Justice Forward, who I mentioned earlier. Donna Belchertown, Mrs. Phelps, wife of Abner Phelps, and the youngest daughter of Justice Forward. The dispensations of Providence have been remarkable towards Mr. Forward's family. 11 children, 9 have been removed by death, 5 by consumption. Another one, Joseph Dyer, age 24. This one gets a little more into the loss of such a young person. This is a grave that's found in Poland. It was found in 2008. It was found in Poland, and it's from the probably about the 1680s from Poland. And it shows a body, a grave that had been dug into later after it was initially buried. The head was chopped off and put between the legs. This is typical. Remember the decapitation thing was common in about 20% of them. An identical grave was found in Connecticut in 1990 of a guy who was buried in 1825, and they went back and dug him up and did exactly the same thing. So we see that was Poland, which is right in that area where Oxford, I believe, was, and then you see literally, the effects of it again in Connecticut in 1825. So why did this happen? People, despite the fact that science was supposed to be advancing, people still believe in all kinds of ghosts, goblins, supernatural spirits. Despite, scientists supposedly studying the body, they had no concept of the body. They picked up humors and things like that, which still in effect. They had no model conception of the circulatory, pulmonary system. Also, there was widespread occult belief. Even if people were religious and went to church every Sunday, they still often believed in a whole range of occult and supernatural phenomena that they thought were real. They weren't joking. They believed in astrology, almanacs, alchemy, just sort of a magical chemistry. They believed in witches, even in the 1700s and early 1800s. They still believed in witchcraft. There were fortune tellers, there were people believed in ghosts. People believed in demons and possession still, really, like they really believed there was still demon possession in 1850, 1830 in some places. They believed in prophetic dreams, having a dream and that dream comes true. There's widespread occult belief. So they believe that Satan is actually present in the world, not as a spirit, but physically running around. Some people believe that. People believed in shape-shifting animals. They saw ghost ships. They saw armies in the sky, and they heard trumpets of Gabriel in the sky. This was a culture steeped in the occult, even though it was Christian. So to drop vampires into that mix, how radical would that seem? Not very. That's why it didn't make a splash when people stuck, when it was introduced. They were like, this is like more of the same. Like, it's really not that radical. And there's also a lot of occult belief mixed into medicine. Even herbalism. Herbalism, using herbs and plants and things like that. That was based on the doctrine of signatures, which is the idea that if there's something on a plant that looked like something on a body, then you should use that part of the plant to treat the body. So kidney beans would get ground up and given someone with kidney problems. Heartworm was red, so they ground it up and gave it to people with heart conditions. Some of the stuff was trial and error, and they actually found out it worked. But the basis for it was this idea that God had left signatures in the form of the plants to tell you what part of the body that it would treat. So yeah, it's really widespread occult belief. There were different types of dream interpretation books. People believed in the zodiac, but they believed it to the extent of like you shouldn't do things at a certain time of the month because like Mercury's in retrograde, so don't harvest your crops till afterwards, or don't get that operation until whatever. So this was really thought to have a physical effect on you. So the fact that vampire belief, I just don't think would have seemed all that radical to them. Now, what did they actually think was going on? The Noxer, still alive in the body. They thought the soul had three parts. This was all the way back to Descartes. They believed the body produced your soul in your vital organs. Okay? They believed that your liver produced natural spirit, which imagine the soul having three parts. A tripartite soul is what the liver. The liver produced a form of soul, it's called the natural spirit. And it was the vegetative or nutritive soul. So it basically, this soul kept your body functioning for the basic bodily functions like digestion and that kind of stuff. Vital spirits, so the natural spirits would travel up in your heart, and your heart would mix it with the blood, and that would turn it into another more higher advanced form of the soul. And then when it reaches your brain, the hypothalamus, it would be transferred, be supposedly mixed with oxygen and become animal spirit, which was the spirit that was conscious and responsible for rational thought. These are all different parts of your soul. And they thought the soul was a gas diffused in your blood. When you cut yourself on a cold day and your finger would be bleeding and you would see the steam, they're like, that's vital spirit escaping from your body, from leaving the blood. And they thought that if soul was present in the body, the blood would not coagulate. So when they dug up those bodies to check who was alive, a couple of them were still ripe and liquid. They're like, something's still producing natural and vital spirit, cut the head off to make sure it didn't turn into animal spirit. They took the heart and the other liver and lungs with the other things. So the parts of the body they destroyed corresponded with a medical understanding of the body and soul. So they thought a body in the grave that still had liquid blood in it was not decaying, therefore it was still alive. It was on auto. It was still making natural spirit and vital spirit, and it needed nourishment, which was the relative soul, and it was sucking out. So when you try to cancel this thing, pull out the heart, that'll get rid of the vital spirit, often burn the liver and lungs too, that takes care of the natural spirit, and you shut the head off, disconnecting it from the system. This was not magic, it was science to them. It wasn't irrational why they chose those three organs or those three things to do to the body. You burn the liver, heart, lungs, and chop the head off for a very specific reason tied to how they understood the body. And the last piece of the puzzle is something called corpse medicine. This is one I did not know about until I wrote this project. And it's the use of skull, blood, fat, flesh, other human organs as medicine, which was very, very common because of that idea that the body would still stay alive for up to 7, well, some of the soul would remain in the body for up to 7 years. So they thought if you made medicine out of body parts, someone who died recently, those body parts would contain soul, and you would be restoring someone by giving them soul-filled human remains. So this was widespread in Europe in the 16 and early 1700s, but died out pretty quickly in England by about the 1730s and 40s, but some doctors were still practicing it as late as the American Revolution. In particular, one doctor, Samuel Stearns, in Boston, he also practiced in the mind. So it was outdated medical technology or medical theory, but it wasn't so far outdated that there was still something doing at the time of the American Revolution. So the idea of using body parts as medicine was still something that was out there, and still doctors were prescribing and doing. So it was becoming less and less common. Here's so it died out in England and the United States, but it was super common in Germany. So Germans kept doing this until the 1840s. So those German Hessian doctors who came over with the troops and started practicing medicine in America and teaching people how to dig up vampires, they also taught them how to use corpse medicine. And the vampire belief is a form of that. You burn the heart down to ashes and give it to someone in their dream. So corpse medicine was taught in medical schools in Germany. These doctors who were trained come over and know how to do it, and they literally start doing what they were trained to do in Germany. So that's the final piece of the puzzle that we're doing. And why didn't doctors put a stop to this? Because medicine was a hot mess in the 19th century. There were all different kinds of competing doctors. There were doctors, practitioners of physics, empirics who were unlicensed amateurs. Anyone could call themselves a doctor. There was no licensing, no tests, no schools until fairly late in the 1800s. It was the Wild West. If you wanted to hang out a shingle tomorrow and said, I'm a doctor, you're a doctor. People with absolutely no training or people with a ton of training. But now what we know about science, we know that training was fairly useless. But there were all kinds of people doing stuff. There were dentists who were also doing surgery. There were these untrained amateurs who were just like, I read a couple of books, I'll take out a gallbladder. And midwives who were largely doing reproductive medicine, but were also caring for the sick on like low-level day-to-day illnesses and wounds and things like that. So midwives did actually do the vast, and women in families did the vast majority of everyday medical care. Apothecaries were pharmacists of the era. Native American doctors were very, very common. People thought Native American medicine was superior to European medicine, and Indian doctors were in serious demand. So much so that white guys used to fake being Indians to give themselves more credibility as doctors. I'm dead serious about that. That was a big phenomenon in the 19th centuries. White guys pretending to be Native American because that gave them more cachet as a doctor. In the South, but also some places in the North, we find a lot of African-American and Afro-Caribbean root doctors. Very common to go to African-American medical specialists in the American South. And how, or even if you were a slave owner on a plantation, there would be African-American medical specialists doing African and Afro-Caribbean medicine. So using foreign medicine was very common. There were also faith healers, people laying on hands and praying. People used all kinds of bizarre cures, quacks, charlatans, con artists, all these crazes and fads, water cures, special diets. Mesmerism, my favorite, metallic tractors. They were knitting needles that were supposedly magnetized, and the guy would just like hold them on the side of your head and just suck the energy, the bad juju out of you or something. This was a white doctor in Connecticut who came up with that and made a fortune off of it, by the way, selling the metallic tractors. Animal magnetism, do-it-yourself surgery. That was a big fad of the 1820s and 1830s during the Jacksonian era. Do-it-yourself medicine. There'd be like books, every man, one was famously called Every Man's a Doctor. And it would be like, this is how to take out a gallbladder. This is how to remove, you know, whatever, a breast cancer from a woman. Like it would just give you like a diagram and you read a few paragraphs and you sharpen up a knife and have at it. So like anything went in terms of medicine. Thomsonian medical system was a sort of mail order herbal medicine system. And there were charts and graphs. You go, well, I've got this illness, this plant. And it was like an early kind of like mass produced. They sent it out in mailers to people and you'd write to them and it's in packets of the medicine. And Shakers also sold medicine in very much the same way as the Thomsonians. They're similar. Shaker medicine and Thomsonian medicine. There were cancer curers who were essentially con artists who did all kinds of mumbo jumbo things and then pulled supposed the cancer out of you. Electricity was brand new, so people would, I don't know, get stuff and just fire it up and stick it on you, and you know, would supposedly cure you and zap you. So literally anything went in the late 1700s, early 1800s. It's really not till the middle of the 19th century that doctors try to start cleaning this all up, forcing out the con men and con women. But one of the things they also force out is they also start forcing out a lot of empirics are women. All midwives are women. A lot of the Indian and African doctors are also women. And also a lot of the folk healers are women. So what starts to happen in the middle of the 1800s is elite college-educated white men start forcing everybody else out of medicine or pushing them down into a subservient position, nurses, and taking over everything and requiring licenses and medical schools and tests and degrees. And that's a way to get rid of all this crazy stuff, but it also puts this group in charge. And that is the last piece of the puzzle. Why don't we know more about this? Because this group covered it up. They were the people who introduced it. Elite college-educated doctors were the people who introduced the practice to the United States. Starting in the 1820s, they wanted to professionalize their field. They wanted tests, licenses, and all that, but it took 50 years for that all to work out. And in the meantime, they started attacking the vampire belief, saying anyone who does this, digging people up and burning them and giving ashes to people, it's crazy, hocus pocus. You've got to stop doing it. So the very people that introduced it turn on the belief. And then they don't want to admit that they were all involved in it earlier in their practices. So I've seen instances where people wrote into medical journals saying that this is a travesty, and yet I found them documented 20 years earlier doing vampire execution. So there's a cover by doctors because they played such a key role in it. Also, by the time you get to that last stage, because it is seen as like country bumpkins are doing this and it's a kind of folk practice, people are embarrassed about it. They switch over from doing it during daytime, broad daylight in public, and people start doing it at night. And not involving authorities or ministers or anyone like that. So there's clearly like some shame involved with it in the last 20 years. We didn't talk about it. And the best case of that is the Mercy Brown incident. This is JB 55's skull, the guy who was found in the cemetery in Connecticut. It's in the Smithsonian. These are Hessian doctors traveling around, usually in in military gear, because they were military personnel. And this is one selling a patent medicine, and there's usually a jester and a monkey that will sell the medicine. That's metallic tractors. That's the highway system of the area. Let's get that. All right. So the last part of it was the doctors trying to cover up the belief. So Mercy Brown's the last high-profile case in 1892. As opposed to these big events that used to happen in public, there was one in Vermont, 1,000 people attended in 1830. By 1892, when Mercy Brown is exhumed in Exeter, Rhode Island, the older male members of the community, of her family, get together and say, we think something's going on. The mom and 2 daughters have died in very quick succession, and now the brother Edmund is sick and dying. They told the father, you've got to do something about this. So all men, and they said, you have to do something about this. So the men, they wouldn't let women go. Usually they were public events back in the 1700s. Everybody, the town, neighbors showed up. All the relatives were lined up there. By the late 1800s, it wasn't a place for women or children. Men kind of met in secret, then went out there one night, dug up Mercy, or dug up everybody, dug up the mom, the two daughters, and Mercy was fresh as could be. She'd been dead for 2 years, so like, it's her. They reburied the other two, cut her chest open, take the heart out, put it on a rock, burn it down to ashes, bring it home, put it in a mixture of wine and medicine, and give it to everyone to drink, and he drinks it. It gets reported in the newspaper, and it goes all over the United States. Actually, England is reporting on it, and it's like, one of our very horrible customs, this is terrible. And Mercy Brown is now the most well-known vampire from New England, but she was probably one of the last in that very final stage. But if you go to New England now and ask anyone who knows about this phenomenon, they're like, Mercy Brown, yeah. But that's literally one of the last ones. So that's the American vampire phenomenon. So, any questions?
Anybody doing it anymore?
There was a case actually in Eastern Europe in 2004 or 2005, where members of the family got sick, a bunch of them died, and they went and dug up the mother, thinking that she was a vampire or something that was infecting people. And let's see, Serbia, and they dug up her body and put the heart out and burned it. And the guy who did it was wanted by the authorities. They tried to arrest him. He like went on the land. I don't know if they ever got him. Maybe it was in Russia or something like that. It's the guy who did it. So yeah, there was an incident in 2004, 2005.
You mentioned something about Indian powers. It was a thing. I mean, Native American effects would be. I mean, are we talking shamans?
Yeah. There was this belief that that Europeans didn't have a high. Doctors were very low repute in the 1700s and 1600s. Doctors were seen as a very low-level occupation. They were seen as slightly above con men. I mean, most people didn't think the medicine was all that good. So Native Americans, for whatever reason, they sort of became this thing where everyone thought Native American medicine was great. And all I can think of is it was much less harsh, because the medicine at that time in Europe was like bleeding and cupping and really what was called heroic medicine. It was very violent to its effect on your body. They'd give you powerful drugs to make you vomit or purge. Like the European medicine at the time was very harsh. So Native American stuff was like more like herbalism, chill. So I think it was maybe not that Native American medicine was so great, it's that European medicine was so bad. Yeah, and also there were some famous incidents where an early guy from the in 1620s healed by a native shaman, so a bunch of people will think that's legitimate there. But it's something that runs all the way through the 1800s. You'll see people pretending to be doctors. It's very common for them to call themselves a Cherokee doctor. But any ethnic group. And then there were actual Native American medical practitioners traveling around doing stuff, but then there were also these fake ones. And most people were not great at telling the difference. There's a very famous one, actually a woman from New England who was Abenaki and was a healer who healed among the Native community and among the white community. Her name was Molly Hawkins. She's very well known in the local history of war in New Hampshire, Maine, Canada area where she was active. So there were legitimate medical practitioners who were Native American, as well as these charlatan types. So, and given, I mean, the fact that none of the forms of medicine really worked that well from a modern standpoint, I mean, choose to believe different types of folk medicine or faith healing or whatever, but they were all about equally ineffective. So no one would have had a much better cure rate than anyone else. And given that European doctors were bleeding, cupping, purging people, that probably did more harm than good to people, severely dehydrating them when they're at their sickest. Is not a great. That's actually what killed Washington. He was sick, but then they did all these things to him, these violent medical procedures. He got dehydrated and died. So the treatment killed him. So
there's a lot of stories of that.
1799, yeah. So I think it's again, dropping this vampire belief into that mix given how crazy medicine was, I just don't think, and people seem very unsurprised by it. They're just like, oh, okay. Because everything else they're doing is so crazy in terms of medicine that doesn't seem like that much of a stretch. I was really surprised the newspapers weren't like, I'm outraged at this practice. People were like, eh.
You think Satan walks around, of course, he's like, yeah, something's like coming out of here.
I mean, you know, that's all I can think of is if you're not surprised or shocked by the vampire belief, what else was going on around you that you accepted as normal up to that point? So, and then you have the desperation factor. These poor families are absolutely wits end. And I think it's one of those things you feel helpless and powerless, and this gives you some feeling you got control over the situation. There's something you can do, even though it's not going to work. It gives people something, make it feel like they're doing something in the most desperate hour when they feel like their family's about to get snuffed out. Now, one thing I haven't been able to wrap my mind around yet with this, I'm still wrestling with one aspect. Remember I mentioned that women are dying about 2 to 1 compared to men, consumption. Same rate you find in the vampire exhumations, most of the people dug up are young women. But it also seems like the families only turn to this when there's one male heir left. And they suddenly start digging up the girls of the family to try to save the one remaining male heir. Now, I can't really, there aren't enough cases of that I can really prove it, but I really get the feeling that that's kind of going on in some situations. That the fear is that the namesake, the family line, the male lineage will be snuffed out, whereas they wouldn't have attempted this for the daughters. And that's kind of one that's just sitting there in my stomach like a rock. And I'm not sure what to do with that. I don't have enough evidence to prove it, but I really get the feeling that that's kind of going on too, that there is a gender aspect and women are valued less than men. I can't get past it. It's one of those things that keeps rearing its head every time I look at the data, and I'm like, but I don't quite know how to wrap my mind around that yet, and working into all of this, that's going on top of all of this. I mean, they're already all dead, so it's better than witchcraft where you kill live people, right? At least they're already dead. You can't do that much harm to them. But you know, there's an awful lot of incidences where like, oh, we've all died, and there's one son left, so we better dig up the daughters to save him. I don't know. What do you think?
It tends to make sense what you say.
Yeah.
Family members dying.
Yeah, I don't have a ton of evidence for that. I feel like that's kind of a stretch, but I'm still seeing it enough that it's...
There's enough statistical evidence for it to be a possibility.
Yeah, and so that's an uncomfortable, and I didn't come to that conclusion until kind of late in the research, that, you know, seeing enough of that.
So, yeah. Really fun though. I really like the presentation. It must be fascinating stuff. All kind of stuff you can dig out.
You know, I had a joke, and I had a joke for the end, and I didn't use it. I said the final nail in the coffin was the professionalization of medicine, and I forgot to use it. I had it written in my notes and everything. Use this joke.
I will say this, after seeing the list of the medical, I'm like, this is not old stuff. The DIY medicine's clearly still very active today.
I mean, there's a lot of medical charlatanism today. I mean, I hate to bring it up, but just look at all the bogus science floating around over the pandemic right now, you know? I mean, could we have a better example of how people are presented with the real science and go with something else? Like, I mean...
But we've seen that in just about every major pandemic. And so the TB pandemic and epidemics are really no different.
Yeah, and you saw it with the smallpox epidemic during the Revolution, whereas the British are like, yeah, we have hardly anyone dying of smallpox, and Washington's army is devastated, and everyone's like, no, we won't get, some people thought it was a conspiracy, literally a conspiracy theory. The British are trying to kill us all, they weren't infected with smallpox, like, therefore we can't do it. So, yeah, there was a lot of fear over the smallpox thing. But I was like really stunned because the statistics were in their infancy at this time, medical statistics, and you see that bump in the deaths from tuberculosis, which were already at 20%. Come right back down, and I'm like, what just happened? And you look at it, it's 1782 to about 1787 or 1788. You know, it's the immediate aftermath of the American Revolution. Why does the TB rate it more than doubles and stays that high for the duration that it takes to die from tuberculosis, 7 years?
Makes sense. Well,
So-
thank you, Brian, for coming out and talking about this. This was a lot of fun. And so we do have snacks, so feel free to enjoy it. And this was live on Facebook or on Zoom, so hopefully it's still up there. Otherwise, we'll put an edited version in the next few weeks, hopefully.
So the cover up is because doctors didn't want to look bad having done this